friends, my name is Marines, and today I've invited a bunch of friends to share with us their least favorite book that they read in 2020.
Hello everybody, it's Cara from wildbookgarden, and my least favorite book I read in 2020 was Foul is Fair by Hannah Capin. I know other people loved this book or thought it handled the themes and topics well. I did not. I hated the way that this book looked at survivors and looked down at sexual assault survivors who sought out help or therapy, and the way it also sneered at people who worked in that field. Neither of those things were challenged by the book. I also hated the writing style. It is first-person present tense, which is difficult to do well anyway, in my opinion, but the way this book was written was so cheesy and over the top, and it really did feel like a parody of a hard-hitting contemporary novel. If you look at this as a Macbeth retelling, which is what it is and what it is marketed as, it doesn't do it very well because the themes and the characters and motivations and things are so distanced from the core story that it really doesn't feel like a retelling except for certain character names or a couple of references here and there. And I think that you can do retellings that are very, very loose. I have read some that I really enjoyed, but this one was so distant from the source material that it really didn't feel like it was related to Macbeth at all. So if you go into this expecting a Macbeth retelling because you know the story, you're going to be disappointed. But if we remove the Macbeth retelling aspect completely from the book, the story makes no sense unless you know the play by Shakespeare. The characters and their decisions and their motivations and even plot elements make absolutely no sense unless you know what they're based on. Characters make nonsensical choices, plot developments kind of happen out of nowhere, the writing is poorly done, the characters are incredibly flat and underdeveloped, and again, making nonsensical choices just for the sake of moving the plot along, which the plot was also very disjointed and unsatisfying. And another thing I really hated is this book's fake feminism. If you are a female character who is not Jade or one of her 3 or 4 friends, you don't matter and you deserve what's coming to you. That's kind of what the book's message seems to be. Now, there are ways to write a story in which the plot or the characters show harmful ideas in a way that makes it clear that the author or the book is not endorsing them. I don't think this book did that. Everything about the way it was written seemed to enforce and endorse what Jade believed about other women and the way that she treated other women and the way that she viewed people who handled trauma in a way that was different from her. Every aspect of the story was poorly done, and every important theme it handled was done badly.
Hi, I'm Caitlin. I've recently started reposting on my YouTube channel BookChats, but more likely you're going to find me on Twitter at Caitlin Vanasse. It's my full name. And my least favorite book of 2020, I would literally never have picked up or read if not for my friend Rebecca, who lent me her copy 2 years ago when I still lived in San Antonio. And I moved it all the way to Minnesota with me. And finally this year I said I have to read this so I can get it back to her. And that is The Post Office, or maybe just Post Office, by Charles Bukowski. I love you, Rebecca, but this book was terrible and I think you know it. I should say that Rebecca is my friend who spent a couple years living in New York. She has much more refined literary taste than me. So this is probably a darling of the East Coast literary elite or something. But to me, it was just a misogynist screed of like just constant plotless misogyny. The main character hates himself and he hates women even more, except when he loves them, but just so he can hate them. I don't know. It's not good. It's not fun. I mean, the post office is featured, that's cool, but it shows up as like this terrible place of bureaucracy. I think to best describe my experience with this book, so one of the things is the copy that my friend lent me actually was part of this book club I used to run where you read and annotate a book and then you pass it along to your friends and they read and annotate it. And then eventually it comes back to you with all their annotations. Very cool, right? Except that there are people like me who hold on to a book for 2 years and don't actually read it. And that's why the book club didn't work. But when I was reading this copy, several of my friends had read it before me. And there was an ongoing discussion in our annotations of where this book was set. I was convinced it was in Chicago. Friends, it was not in Chicago. It was somewhere in California. You don't find out till the end of the book. And I still couldn't tell. Like I couldn't tell until the narrator literally told me on the page, like, something about where it was. And that just describes my experience with this book, I feel like. I couldn't even tell where it was set because it was just 0 out of 10 would not recommend Don't Read The Post Office by Charles Bukowski.
Hello, my name is Rachael and my channel name is The Boston Book Biddy, and this is where I talk about my least favorite book of the year, and that has to be Cait May by Chip Cheek. In the summer, this book made waves. That hashtag publishing paid me became trending on Twitter, and this author was very transparent in saying, I got paid in an obscene amount for my debut novel, and this was my debut novel. And once that got out, I feel like everybody did a reading vlog of this book. I know I was inspired to, and of course did it. I followed through. And I don't understand how this guy made as much money as he did. Like, the overall story was meant to be like about Effie and Henry's sexual awakening, but it was strictly from Henry's perspective, and it was just boring, and I couldn't actually relate to this guy. I assume that this author is someone that's close to my father's age, and I get this vibe that this author just longs for the good old days, and it's just not something I could relate to. And this guy clearly doesn't know how to write for female pleasure, and it's just, it was not good. And it's the choices that these characters would make. You kind of feel for them in the beginning, and the more the story progressed, the more I felt that these were terrible people that I just couldn't root for. And in the end, I absolutely despised it. All I got from this book was that you marry for companionship, not necessarily for lust. And eventually you just tolerate the other person's sins. If you're a romantic at heart, I would highly recommend that you stay away from this book. This book was not good. Absolutely not. I think it was one of the few books that I actually rated 1 star on Goodreads. But thank you very much for watching my segment, and I hope to see you guys on my channel.
Hola y'all, I'm Michelle Flores, aka Shelly Flowers. I am a booktuber, author-tuber, and sometimes teacher-tuber here on YouTube. You can also find me on other social media platforms as @ShellyFlowers. This video, I'm going to talk about my least favorite book of 2020. I do want to preface this by saying this was a backlist self-published title, so this was not a book that came out in 2020. I think it came out in 2015 originally, but I read it this year, and boy do I regret it. This is The Rose and the Crane. I hated this book, and it sucks because I loved the premise. So the premise of this book is the War of the Roses meets ancient Japanese samurais. Normally I'm on board because I love historical revisionism when it's done in an effective way. Unfortunately, this author could not pull this idea off. The characterization was offensive, to put it lightly, and there were just so many missed opportunities of really exploring the differences between Japanese culture and English culture from these time periods. It just didn't even make sense from a logical perspective. Like, there were times when the English soldiers were trying to learn Japanese, or the Japanese soldiers were trying to learn English, and the way that the language acquisition worked just didn't make sense as someone who speaks 2 languages. Like, I've gone through this process and it just doesn't work the way that it was described in the book. There were also times where scenes of one battle would take up 30 to 40 pages, but then years would pass between chapters and we would not know what happened with the characters. So unfortunately, this book was a huge miss, and I do not recommend it at all.
Hi Mari, it's Kathy, and for those of you who don't know me, my name is Kathy Trithardt. You can find me here on BookTube as well as Instagram and Twitter, all under that really strange surname, Kathy Trithardt. The book that I liked the least and that was the most disappointing this year was the Stonewall Riots. I thought, as you might think, that this was going to be a graphic novel about the Stonewall Riots. It ended up being incredibly disappointing. 1, it's very thin. 2, it doesn't actually tell you anything about what happened at the Stonewall Riots. It doesn't even mention Marsha P. Johnson, for instance, but it does have a very gay, very white, predominant take of recent queer history, and I found that extremely disappointing. And sometimes when it does reference people from history who are queer and people of color, it doesn't actually mention them by name, it just has their image. And I was super disappointed because I wanted to know more about the Stonewall Riots, and I didn't learn anything from this.
Hello, my name is Cait, and I'm from the channel chaptercviii. You can also find me on Twitter or Instagram at chaptercviii. My worst book of 2020 was Go Mutants by Larry Doyle. This book was actually a dumpster fire, and I've never wanted to throw a book into a flame more than I have this one. The main character of this book is Blue, and his fingers are described as being phallic, and it just, if he wasn't a teenager, it might not be as disturbing, but with the fact that he is a teenager and then other teenagers in this book are really overly sexualized in a way that makes me actually disgusted, I just couldn't do it. I couldn't deal with it. It was just not palatable to me. I really, really like weird books. I love weird books. This wasn't just weird, it was disturbing and disgusting. Not to mention the writing was like all over the place. It was super unreliable. I hated it so much.
Hello everybody, my name is Chloe from the booktube channel Brunette Bibliophile, and the worst book that I read in 2020 was Reverie by Ryan LaSala. This was a pick for my book club, and I wish it could have worked out, but it really didn't. I'm not even sure I could tell you what this book was actually about. Something about dreams, I think. The concept was interesting in synopsis form, but the execution was not. I think with this book, it felt like we were in one place and then suddenly we were in another and another and another, and it just kept going. And it was really confusing to the point where I was very upset with how this was going. But I stuck through it because I didn't want to DNF a book club book, and it ended up being a 1-star rating for me. And it's the only low rating that I gave all of 2020. This is the only 1-star book I read all last year. Maybe this one worked out better for you than it did for me, but this ended up on my worst of 2020 list.
Hi, I'm Nicole Sweeney, and you can find me at SweeneySays here on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, all the places. The worst book that I read in 2020 was absolutely Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins. I mean, I also read The Selection by Kira Cass, both for House Salt, so thanks House Salt, but nothing upset me and disappointed me in the way that Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes did. It just undermined so much of the genuinely fantastic original trilogy that she wrote, and I wish that she didn't do that to us.
My least favorite book of the year will probably come as no surprise, seeing as how it's pretty much the only book that I ranted about last year, and that is The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne Collins. From a technical standpoint, I think the biggest miss of this book is the pacing. It ends up splitting the story in these ways that I felt wasn't very cohesive, and the middle portion of this book drags. I understand that it isn't a book that you're necessarily supposed to enjoy, but there is something to be said about like crafting and pacing and making sure that your story is moving either at an even clip or in a way where the rises and falls feels very natural to your reader. And this didn't feel that way. Oftentimes the end of sections and different parts kind of fell like anvils in ways that was very jarring. Also from a characterization standpoint, I felt like a lot of the characters fell really flat. There could be something to said about a lot of these people being viewed through the perspective of President Snow, who is the main character, and his view being very limited of other people, but I don't think that it quite got there, especially with the choice to tell this in third person. It was not close enough to President Snow and his thoughts to be like a fully immersive experience or like an exploration of his psyche at all, but it was limited enough even in the third person where you had all of these other characters just feeling completely flat and one note. Your mileage may vary on what exactly this book was trying to do. Is it an origin story? Is it a play on origin stories? And Collins is this big mastermind who's giving us this breakdown of tropes commonly used in origin stories. What exactly is happening here? Like, I don't know. But I think you're supposed to be able to gather something about what made Snow's rise to power possible. And I just don't buy a lot of the elements that Suzanne Collins is telling us are here. Like, for instance, Snow is supposed to be super charming, which is how he gained a lot of trust and a lot of power, but is he at all charming in this book? Absolutely not. His character comes across so wooden and forced that it is amazing to me that like nobody else in the story is picking up on the fact that this guy is literally just thinking about murdering people usually, but he's like, I am charming. That's how it read to me, at least. This is not a worthwhile entry to any sort of the story or the themes or what we explore in the original Hunger Games. And is it particularly effective? Or does it have much to say about like evil people rising to power? Absolutely not. And no amount of like, but he was poor, or one time he thought he was in love is worthwhile to me here. Either as like at face value, as like this is what Suzanne Collins actually thinks happens, made this person, or as like some sort of commentary on how we accept these tropes in media, because the commentary wasn't necessarily there. I don't think that there's enough of a tone or or that this is framed in a way where you necessarily understand that is what Collins was doing. So I think she failed her mission in either regard, and I still don't honestly understand what that mission is or why she thought that this book was necessary at all.
Hi, I'm Noria, Chronicles of Noria on YouTube. You can also find me as Chronicles of Noria on Instagram, but Noria the Reader on Twitter. And my least favorite book of 2020 has to be Angry God by L.J. Shen. The reason being that I found, one, the characters were very annoying, but worse than that, they were not compelling. I found that the plot was all over the place. It was repetitive. If you've read any of L.J. Shen's work, you realize that you could just switch the names for other characters' names and it will be the exact same book. She brought nothing new to the table, and she did not give me a compelling plot or compelling characters to get me to actually enjoy the book. So it was an absolute disappointment, which is really heartbreaking because I was really looking forward to that book.
Hi everybody, my name is Saajid and I'm from the channel Books on My Social Life. You can also find me on Twitter and Instagram at musaho_books. My least favorite book of the year, without any shadow of a doubt, would have to go to Rocking Randy by Bona King. And that's not really the fault of the book, it's more my fault because before reading this book, I was not aware of what I was getting myself into. Some of y'all might laugh at me for this, but I was not privy to what the Omega verse is or what Mpreg meant before going into this book, and suffice to say I was very perplexed when I encountered certain things that happened in the story. I don't know how explicit I can be on Marinez's channel, so I'm just going to keep it very clean and say that it wasn't my cup of tea. But the quirks and the kinks of this genre aside, my main issue with it doesn't really have to do with that. It's more so with the fact that the story is terribly written. There were grammatical errors and punctuation errors, like, oh my god, copy edit. I know it's self-published, but do better. The characters were completely void of personality. They were as bland as the paper that they were written on. The plot, I don't even know what to say about the plot because it barely existed. But my main issue with this book is that there was some really gross things relating to consent that I was not a fan of. So yeah, it just wasn't my cup of tea. And moral of the story, if you don't know what Omegaverse or Mpreg is, Google it before you try to read something in that genre because you'll be very confused like I was when I was reading this book.
Hiya, my name's Jocelyn and you can find me at the channel Yogi with a Book. My least favorite book that I read this year was Undercover Bromance by Alyssa K. Adams. This is the second book in the Bromance Book Club romance series, which I happened to really enjoy the first book of, which is part of the reason that this one felt like such a betrayal. To go in sort of ascending order and things that bothered me the least to the most, at the bottom is the writing. There were so many times I would read a sentence that literally did not make sense that I had to reread it 3 or 4 times and sometimes just put the book away. There was also a really terrible B-plot, which is one of my least favorite tropes of all time, where we had a white liberal second wave feminist falling in love with a conservative vet. But the thing that really just makes this unforgivable for me is our main character and the general plot that we use to get through this romance. Liv quits her job as a cook when she sees the head chef make a really skeezy move on another worker, and then she makes it her business to take him down, not with any sort of solidarity that she now knows that there are women who have been maltreated by this man in power, but just for her own ego. Throughout this book, she is constantly talking over other women. It starts at that very first moment when she decides to quit. Her thought is not that she is mad that this man is taking advantage of his position, but ew, how gross, she would never touch him. The real point that made me hate her, though, is when she finds out that one of her friends was assaulted by this guy, and she gets mad at the friend for not telling her, and then follows up with the line that the friend is no better than the men who are covering up for him because she didn't feel comfortable speaking out. I cannot abide a book that is completely made up of gaslighting and victim blaming. Even if Liv does kind of learn her lesson at the end, she never fully apologizes, and this has just put me off from this author's other works. Anyway, thanks Marinez for letting me vent. I do not recommend this book to a single person.
Hello everyone, my name is Paola from the channel Paola Guerrero. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram at Guerreror, and I also have a blog which is called By My Shelf. That's shelf with 2 F's at the end, .wordpress.com. My least favorite book that I read in 2020 was The Worst Best Man by Mia Sosa. Oh my goodness, just thinking about that book enrages me. Like, it fills me with so much anger. there were no stakes in that book whatsoever, because it's between a Brazilian American wedding planner and the brother of the guy who left her at the altar. And she never seemed like she was in love with the guy, like, at all. And she ended up hating the brother way more than she ended up hating the actual guy who left her at the altar. And the brothers didn't really get along, so where was that tension that, oh, I can't date you because you are my brother's ex-girlfriend? Also, the sex scenes were really, really awkward. There's a quote that where the man says that he's like a golden retriever, so you tell him how to do stuff and he will kindly obey. And it was like, why would you say that in bed? Why? Just, no, stop it. It was so bad. So bad.
Thank you so much to everybody who answered my call for volunteers. I will leave in the description all of their information and links to their channels and their Twitter so you guys can check them out. I have a collaboration video of favorite books of 2020, which I will link as well, and a video with our most anticipated of 2021 will be coming up soon. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon.